I've been on YouTube since its infancy, back in the MySpace era of the internet. YouTubers like Smosh and Charlie is So Cool Like, Dax Flame, Niga Higa, love them all, but I was never really into the Vlog Brothers like a lot of other people were at the time. I still saw the immense value in the community that they cultivated, of course, the Nerdfighters. This was back in a time when being a nerd really wasn't considered to be cool, and you couldn't make money off of YouTube yet. So the people who were there were just big dorks wanting to start a dorky community. There's now plenty of content out there that promotes the idea that nerds are cool. And although John and Hank Green were somewhat iconic at the time for pioneering this idea, they're no longer really considered as innovative and original as they once were. And because I was never really into them when they first started putting out videos, that nostalgia effect doesn't really apply to me. I get my dorky content from other creators. So with that backstory, with that knowledge about who I am and about where I come from within the YouTube sphere, I'd like to talk about this. Oh my god, I'm so pissed. John Green has written many books, and I've read a lot of those books despite not having been a part of the Nerdfighters community, like Looking for Alaska, An Abundance of Catherines, Turtles All the Way Down, Fault in Our Stars, and my personal favorite, Paper Towns, of which, when I was a angsty teenager, I used to highlight passages that particularly spoke to me, such as, "You're just a really loud, awkward ninja." I read this book at exactly the right time for it to have a profound influence over me, because I wanted more than anything to be as romantically complex as its leading lady, Margot Roth Spiegelman, during the years of my life in middle school when I was being exceptionally bullied. Now, in my late 20s, I'm able to reflect a little bit more critically on Paper Towns and realize that the glaring issue with this story is in that particular character, Margot, because she promotes this character archetype called manic pixie dream girl. John Green's women in general, across many of his books, embody this archetype, and it's problematic, but I'm not going to get into it too much. I just want to make sure that I mention it because it does crop up in Will Grayson, albeit in a smaller way, so it's worth noting. The main issue with this book, and the reason that I felt compelled to make a video complaining about this book in particular, is because, oh my god, are there some toxic relationship dynamics that this book promotes. So first, to give you a very general summary of the book, there are two main characters, okay? They're both called Will Grayson, just like the title implies. One is the cringy embodiment of MySpace era emo, so I call him MySpace Will, and the other one that I'm going to be talking about a lot more in this video embodies another character that John Green seems to write a lot, the hollow, pathetic nerd boy Will. This is essentially the same character, if you've read any of John Green's other books, as Pudge from Looking for Alaska and Quentin in Paper Towns, in that they are all heavily relatable to their intended reader demographic. Dorks who feel pathetic for being so dorky, but end up being lovable by the end of the story to someone, generally a manic pixie dream girl, and come out of their shells in an over-the-top and inspirational sort of way. Now, obviously, this is all just my opinion, but I think John Green was still catering to his Nerdfighter audience when he wrote this book. This book was written in 2010, and Nerdfighters sort of became a thing in 2008. So this was in the Nerdfighter heyday. The idea that someone as pathetically hollow and dorky as Pudge or Quentin, or in this case Will, could find purpose in their lives could have been meant as a message to the Nerdfighter audience to draw inspiration from. I know Paper Towns did it for me in a weird way with Manic Pixie Margot, so it isn't a far stretch to say. John Green even dedicated Will Grayson to one of the first Nerdfighters to really start the community, who he describes as becoming more comfortable and open with his sexual orientation, and also saw the many challenges that he faced with integrity and courage. He inspired a lot of the book, so I wanted to dedicate it to him. Hollow, pathetic nerd boy Will Grayson, John Green, Nerdfighters. Okay. Take from my opinions and John's dedication here as you will. Okay, so we have, ready, MySpace Will, and we have John Green. Nerdy Will. MySpace Will, Nerdy Will. Cool. There are also some secondary characters that are also really important, and they're kind of the ones that promote these toxic relationships that I'm going to be talking about. The first one is Tiny, who is this massive, gay, dramatic icon who physically kind of just reminds me from Mikey from Recess, if you know what that is. And then there's Jane, a girl that Nerdy Will describes as having curly hair and not being his type. Fine, whatever, Will. So big old gay Tiny is Nerdy Will's best friend and comes across as exceptionally self-absorbed. He pushes Nerdy Will around throughout the story and tries to get him to take risks and even ask out Jane. In a way, he's the manic pixie dream girl of this story, though he does develop a more multidimensional personality near the very end. Overall, he's still very archetypal and very written by John Green. This relationship between Tiny and Nerdy Will is my first big issue with this story because the relationship is toxic. There are multiple points throughout the story where Tiny does what he thinks is best for Will and not what Will thinks is best for himself, of which Will then gets upset at him for, obviously. You could possibly have read it as endearing and just being a supportive friend in 2010, maybe. But to me, 10 years later, it reads as Tiny being controlling and manipulative. Tiny even complains near the end of the book how he feels unappreciated for everything he does for his friends. But what does he expect when the things he does aren't asked for or even wanted by those same friends? Nerdy Will and Tiny have a big fight over Tiny indirectly calling Will out for being such a pathetic character. He is, but still. And Will is the one who apologizes to Tiny over it for getting upset. He tells Tiny that he loves him despite how much of an asshole Tiny can be. Does Tiny apologize for being a selfish asshole in the first place? No. Does Tiny apologize for making decisions for Will without his consent? No. And here, the idea that Tiny is just being Tiny and that Will accepts him for it lies, which is a completely toxic mindset for these characters to have when they're supposed to be best friends. There's no respect in this dynamic. Tiny does whatever he thinks is best for Will and ignores what Will is actually comfortable with. He manipulates and pushes him around beyond what would consider a friend helping one out of one's shell and comfort zone. How is that okay in any friendship, let alone for best friends? Tiny is a bad friend, full stop. Even Nerdy Will, as pathetic and meek as he is, deserves better. I love you despite your flaws doesn't work when the flaws are toxic and not being addressed as something that needs to change. The story can't be one-sided when both parties need to be better about communication and overall respect. To further drive home that this book is promoting this toxic relationship, by the way, the entirety of the school ends up telling Tiny how much they appreciate him in this dramatic, over-the-top way. We appreciate you, Tiny Cooper. We appreciate the love that you show and give to us all. Even if it's unprompted, even if it's forced, even if it's selfish, even if it's unwanted, and even if it comes with a little sprinkle of manipulation as well. Okay, so there's that toxic relationship. And then there's the one that literally made me throw the book against the wall because I was so angry about the way that it resolved itself. The relationship between Nerdy Will and Jane. As I've already said, Nerdy Will makes it clear when he meets Jane that she's not his type, and he does so in a way that frankly makes him sound kind of like an incel. To quote the book, she becomes so pretty so suddenly that it's almost like a magic trick. But it's not like I want her or anything. Not to sound like a jerk, but Jane isn't really my type. Her hair's kind of disastrously curly, and she mostly hangs out with guys. My type's a little girlier, and honestly, I don't even like my type of girl that much, let alone other types. Not that I'm asexual, I just find romance drama unbearable. This to me, honestly, just sounds like incel cringe, though I could be overreacting or taking this too seriously. Anyway, the important thing I took from this is that Jane wasn't Nerdy Will's type. but he still found her pretty in a way. Sure, fine, whatever. This is inner monologue we're talking about. This is very early on in the book, and then he spends the next half of it going back and forth as to whether he actually likes her or not. There's even a point where she tries to kiss him, and he turns her down, and he says that he just wants to be friends with her. Okay, sure, fine. At this point, fine. The problem is, he only finally decides that he's interested in her when she gets back together with her ex-boyfriend. Yeah, he only wants her because he now cannot have her. The way that he talks about this with Jane is so absolutely jealous and petty that it made me, as the reader, completely despise Nerdy Will as a character overall. There's a point in the story where Nerdy Will and Jane are having this like 5 minutes of true honesty thing. And it's a good idea in concept, but Will is a complete asshole to Jane about the guy that she's dating. And it's really not prompted. It's just pure jealousy. And instead of being offended, Jane thinks it's funny and she commends him on being so honest and truthful and straightforward. To quote from the book, no, he goes to Latin. We met at a poetry slam. That's Jane. Of course you did. My God, I can picture the slimy bastard. He's tall and shaggy haired and he plays a sport. Soccer probably, but he pretends like he doesn't even like it because all he likes is poetry and music and you, and he thinks you're a poem and tells you so, and he's slathered in confidence and probably body spray. She laughs, shaking her head. So, yeah, she thinks this is funny. We're supposed to think, haha, it's so funny that Will's being a douche nozzle. So Jane finally gets the idea here that Nerdy Will likes her. But of course, only after he's just found out that she's now back together with her ex. And throughout the rest of the book, he continues to make petty little jabs in reference to the ex-boyfriend to Jane, who doesn't defend the ex-boyfriend or tell Will that he's being petty and jealous. No, because that would show strength of character, and that's not something that Jane is supposed to embody. Absolutely not. She's supposed to be easily persuaded out of her relationship. Right near the end of the book, she breaks up with the boyfriend, in part as she tells Will, because there was a little voice in her head called Will Grayson telling her that her boyfriend was a douche for talking about his Olympic inspirations. Of course, she can make her own decisions about who she wants to be with, but the fact that Will's petty, jealous comments contributed to her decision to break up with the boyfriend is terrible. It puts out the idea that being pouty and petty about a guy who you've never met and you don't know personally, who's dating a girl you like, will lead to that girl breaking up with the guy to be with you, and that such behavior is overall not a bad thing. But it is. It's so childish and immature to rag on someone because you're jealous of them, especially to their partner who you have a stupid crush on that you could have done something about for half of a friggin' novel, and you decided against it. And then, on page 224, they kiss. And I threw the book against the wall because Nerdy Will doesn't deserve to get this girl. He deserves a better friend than Tiny, but Jane can honestly do better than a guy who turns her down, flip-flops on his feelings, and then only shows interest once she's unavailable and is a huge, petty child about the whole thing. Overall, in my opinion, Will Grayson has aged very poorly. While John Green may have been fine writing a nerdy shell of a pathetic main character for his Nerdfighter audience to relate to, and an over-the-top gay best friend for readers to appreciate for his quirks, and a literal Jane for his female readers to relate to in her normalcy back in 2010, these character types seem incredibly outdated and even mismanaged by today's standards. Tiny is selfish and manipulative and needs to address these issues before one could ever consider him worth appreciating and befriending. Nerdy Will is arguably on the fringes of becoming an incel, and although mostly a hollow shell of a pathetic character, still manages to come across as jealous and petty in his relationship pursuits. Put plainly, he doesn't deserve Jane, even though he thinks that he does over another guy that she has interest in. And the fact that she comes crawling back to him despite his jealous and childish behavior is promoting a relationship dynamic that really doesn't deserve to be glamorized. I think John Green is an incredibly important YouTuber. And honestly, I cried just as hard as anyone else did when I read Looking for Alaska. But his characters from back in the MySpace era of the internet leave something to be desired. I don't think I'll ever read Paper Towns again, honestly, because a part of me knows that it will never be as incredible and profound to me as it was when I was in middle school and when I was middle school Mira. And I don't want to spoil that facade for myself. It remains a product of its time, just like Will Grayson clearly ends up being. But now us nerds have grown up and realized that we're so much more than pathetic shells that fall at the feet of those more confident. We're multidimensional and strong and independent, and so much more than a main character in a John Green book could ever hope to become.